I would like to specify three things. Number one is I'm going to talk about the influence of revolution on literary museums in Russia. Second is, in the end, we will move towards our museum, State Museum of History of Russian Literature, named after Vladimir Dal, which is a major museum consisting of 10 separate museums: Lermontov, Prishvin, Brusov, Dostoevsky, and other authors. And finally, of the 3 points I wanted to make is that there is no beginning in the revolution and no end to it. So 1917 gave the life certain languages, certain specifications which are active up to date. This is slide number 1. Uh, so I will continue the topic started by Professor Dobrenko, probably in a different way and in different light of museums. The beginning of 20 years, modernization was brought about by the logic of different philosophers, different phenomena. Here you have Leo Tolstoy, who was against traditional church, traditional lifestyle, traditional values. Then there are futurists who were called the slap in the face of society, and they wanted to get rid of Pushkin and Dostoevsky. And finally, Lenin, who called Tolstoy the mirror of Russian Revolution. Nowadays, not all people in our country remember that the party uh, leadership of literature was initiated by the article of Lenin called Party Organization and Party Literature, published in November 1905, after the manifesto of 17th of October, uh, which converted Russia from traditional monarchy to constitutional monarchy. But this article wasn't very important, and it wasn't noticed a lot. But during the Soviet times, this little article signed N. Lenin, that was one of his pseudonyms, pen names in the 20s and 30s and until Perestroika. This text became a foundation, as we were taught in schools and universities. There was a revolution, how the party ruled literature. Karl Eiermacher, a famous German uh, artist, called this process uh, государствление, that is making a state led. So this process, which finished in 1934 at the Congress of Writers, literature became one of the industries in Russia. And the writers were called the engineers of human souls. And the article indicated three main principles: классовость, партийность, народность. So class-led, party-led, people-led, and this collective ideology was to be the ruling force for the writer. And class is a group of people united by their attitude to the implements and to the labor. So that's the foundation of the party leadership in literature. And I would like to very carefully to object to Evgeny Dobrenko, who mentioned the internal logic between in the relationship between revolution and avant-garde, and Evgeny mentioned the pragmatism of Stalin era, and I would say that pragmatics is more a ruling force than was mentioned earlier, because the overcoming of utopia was taking place. In economics, it was military communism, which was an attempt to abolish mm, financial relations. In politics, it was permanent revolution, and this was what Trotsky was condemned for, and it was necessary measure because the transition from the victory of socialism in one separate uh, country, and there was a joke about Pope, and I hope I'm politically correct, that Pope issued an edict that the end of the world is possible in one separate country. And the same logic worked in the territory of art. Prolet cult uh, were created before the victory of Bolsheviks, and in 1920s they were under the Ministry of Education, but it is the same utopia which was abolished and replaced even during Lenin's life by a different task which was outlined at the third Congress of Komsomol, and it sounded like learn communism. And the whole system of education, higher education, actually were to be submitted to this slogan. Uh, so in 1920, Lenin put forward the slogan, learn communism. That is a peek out of history, only the facts which are in line with socialist Marxist doctrine. And there are some literary and artistic education and enlightenment education bodies, higher literature course, which existed till the 20s. What did it mean? In practice, it meant that the history of literature and modern literature were rewritten in accordance with revolutionary doctrine. And I often asked our students, why do we have Spartak and do not have Cicero or Julius Caesar football teams? And it's clear what the answer is, because Spartak is in line with the revolution and Julius Caesar isn't. So the story of literature and modern literature were rewritten, and I would like to say that the history of literature is the sum of three factors. That is canonization of opinions about authors. This is if, for example, Tolstoy tells Chekhov that Shakespeare is no good, but you are even worse, it's not important. So canonization of certain opinions and role of writers. The second is hierarchy, who is more important and who is less. And finally, literary reputation of writers. And this is the words used by Ivan Rozanov, a scholar who converted it into a literary term. Literary reputations were also transformed, they were rewritten, but before I move to it, I must tell you that there are different ways of canonizing. Some of them are cited in here. It's literary criticism, publishing strategies. So if they are published in certain literary sources, then you are classic. Then school program inclusion. Means that the status is higher. And then inclusion of state ideology and museums for several writers. For example, Dobrolubov Museum was set up, and Apollon Grigoriev didn't have a museum. This is the same as you cannot have a football team called Julius Caesar. So the reputations were corrected. So Pushkin remained a freedom-loving young man, and still a school program includes some poems, and some poems are excluded. The same is true for Dostoevsky, for Chekhov, but let's take an example of Gorky, who was a role model of social realism. And here you can see that Gorky was a proletarian by birth. He supported Lenin. He wrote a novel Mother, and he was the founder of social realism. But just now we know that Gorky didn't go to Italy for medical treatment, but into emigration. He was Nietzschean, and he was a modernist belonging to a religious sect. And so, what actually is true? You have to take into account both right and left column. This is the main idea of my speech. You cannot just follow unquestioningly the literary reputation, but you cannot just discard it as well. You can say that in the 20th century, there were two attempts of changing history, not only in the 20s, mentioned above, but also in the 80s, the second part of the 80s, when a returned literature was published. That is Gumilov, Akhmatova, Platonov, and many others, including Zamyatin and the followers. In the 80s, Soviet literary pantheon was destroyed, and Fadeev, Furmanov, and Chernyshevsky were taken out of school programs, and more attention was paid to samizdat and tamizdat literature, and you know what it means. Of course, resurrection of Platonov and Bulgakov is excellent and is a correct thing to do, but in the 19th century it's very hard to sort out things without Chernyshevsky. So Chernyshevsky cannot be easily discarded, and when uh, and Professor Dobrenko says that there is a joke that there is only one poet in Russia called Mandelstak. And this is very simplistic uh, idea, uh, but if you look at the problems of history of literature of the 20th century, you have to state that we are in a very special situation. Uh, you cannot choose any canon. You cannot say that one poet is not good. Music of Revolution 12. Uh, and it's not correct to say that the first Russian poets are Pasternak and Mandelstam, and there was no one before that. Even you can say about cataphatic history of literature. There is an apathetic logic and cataphatic. And we are talking about uh, that you cannot build the history of literature uh, on historic doctrines, but history of literature is that's what exactly what's happening, and uh, the history of literature should include a moment of reflection. You have to analyze how this or that happened, and no Russian literary figure appeared out of nowhere, but context should be discovered. In there is a very interesting museum of Nikolai Dobrolubov in Novgorod, and they explain to the school children visiting the museum, telling when they tell that Dobrolubov was born and bred in Novgorod. During Soviet times, we were told that the life, the evolution of life, is on the sta- state, and if you look at Dobrolubov and his writings about his literature, on literature, Ostrovsky and others, and nowadays in the museum you do not get the idea of the background of literature, and we do not get any idea about his short life and his influence on literature. I must say that Dobrolubov is a genius of literary criticism. The same applies to Andrei Platonov, uh, who is made to to be a Protestant against suppression, as someone against Stalinism, but it's not all. Platonov uh, was much further to the left than the official doctrine. So when you're talking about this or that writer, you just need to give the fuller picture. The museum workers are sure that museum starts where the collection of museum objects, exhibits are taken together. And although it is the case, but there is also other museums like Museum of Dreams, Museum of Marshmallows, and you do not have the objects in there, any real exhibits. So literary museums, they are a special class of museum. They are kind of museum of dreams, a museum of perceptions of writer. So it's very important to tell how the perceptions changed with times. And in here you can have the picture not only of Freud but Schmidt, uh, who Thomas Schmidt developed staged identity concept. That means that we can show in the museum some sort of identity brought about by our story, but not the mythic reality which was left behind and went into the past. And I'm moving towards the end. And now our museum, which named after Dal, uh, and was set up by Vladimir Bonch-Bruyevich, who actually moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow in 1918. Bonch-Bruyevich laid an emphasis not to the real places where the writers lived and worked, but he thought that museum should be the unity of five components: museum, library, archive, institute, and publishing house. And our museum is exactly this type of museum. And I would like to mention that the main mission of our museum is to create the history of Russian Revolution during this strange and contradictory 20th century. That's what we are all about, and that's what we are busy with. Uh, just because we have the materials dealing with the hundreds of years of Russian literatures, and without those materials we cannot resolve our task. So very soon we are hoping to give our visitors a new project, a new building in the center of museum. It is to be opened in the beginning of the next year, and we will have sets of exhibits in a non-memorial place. We are not going to create the same system, a static system of memorial houses. We are going to present a picture of Russian literature of 20th century from the point of view that I introduced to us. We are interested in rights and lefts, radicals and conservative people, and so on. And it will be a museum telling a story of literature, not showing it only. And this is not the only project. I would like to touch upon another couple of them. The another project is the history of reading in museum in Stalin in a period during Samizdat, changing of media. Then there is a квартирный вопрос exhibition, and here we wanted to explore yes, the issue through the living environment to show the general elements which were applicable to many writers. And finally, the exhibition that is brought to you here, it is the 12, and it is the 12 authors who are supposed to give you three-dimensional picture of Russian literature of 20th century. Lunacharsky, drama writer, a literary critic, and a minister, and also writers totally different, opposing the regime. Only only this way you can create a capathetic picture of Russian literature of 20th century. You cannot reach 100% objectivity, but we've got a task, and we have to overcome revolutionary modernization, which is still active and